All right, we are at time, and I see most of the class logged in here. Again, good morning, everyone, and thank you for being flexible and meeting online today. As with our other classes in general, I'll record this and post the video later on today so you can reference that again. And if you have any questions during lecture today, please don't hesitate. You can just unmute yourself and speak up is going to be the easiest way to do that, or you can post in the chat as well. If a question comes up in chat and I'm not seeing it, feel free to just speak up and direct my attention there as well. Sometimes it's hard to keep track of everything going on. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and jump into the appendicular skeleton, our topic for today. And just give me a quick confirmation. My screen is sharing okay. You see the big radiograph of an arm. Okay, great. Just want to make sure you're looking at the slide because that's what's important. So for today's class, we are going to enjoy a short segment of human and mouse anatomy in the news. And then we're going to continue our coverage of the skeletal system, moving on to the appendicular skeleton, talking about the pectoral girdle and the upper limbs. And then if we have time, moving on to the lower limbs and the pelvic girdle. We'll then wrap things up with just a few reminders and a ticket out from today's class. So let me pause here for a quick second and see if anyone has questions about what's going on in class before we start in. Okay, well, human anatomy in the news. So this is an interesting one. As we've been discussing in great detail, bones are or living dynamic tissue that are constantly being restructured. And importantly, they're being restructured to the environment that they experience, and specifically the amount of stressors that are put on those bones. So the way that weight is put on the bone and how weight is put on the bone. Now, as you might imagine, this can create big problems for people that are not experiencing any stress on their bones because the bones won't, they'll lose strength and won't develop accordingly. And this is the case for folks that are, say, bedridden, but also, interestingly, for a small subset of humans that are lucky enough to enjoy spending time in outer space. In outer space, of course, there's no gravity, and so your bones don't have to do as much work to hold you up and provide support because they don't need to act counter to any force, right? And it's a huge problem because astronauts very, very rapidly lose bone density when they're in space. Now, to counteract that, astronauts, say, for example, on the International Space Station, will spend 2+ hours a day just working out. So they do cardio work and they also do kind of resistance training to make sure that those muscles are experiencing stressors and they don't lose a bunch of bone mass during their time in space. And this is, the longer you are in space, the more of a potential issue this is. Now, research recently has tried to understand this better and find out ways to mitigate that by using genetically modified mice. And so this is pretty cool. They modified a certain gene. We don't get into the molecular and genetic details here, but they modified a gene so that mice would exhibit greater growth in both their bones and correspondingly in their skeletal muscle. And you can see the two mice here. You can see there's one that's genetically modified on the left, the big boy, and then a kind of quote unquote normal mouse on the right. They then treated these genetically modified, they then brought genetically modified and unmodified mice in the space. They also gave them a drug treatment, so it's a little bit of a complicated experiment. The takeaway message is you can see here in the figure is that those mice that were brought into space that were untreated, you can see here, lost bone density. So these are images of their spongy bone, and you can see there's many less trabeculi, and there's greater holes between those trabeculi. And this is in contrast to those mice that were genetically modified. And you see those on the bottom here where that bone structure maintained its integrity. Now, these are mice, of course, but cool to think about an experiment bringing mice into space. And the results were very clear. This treatment definitely helped mice. Now, are we going to genetically modify humans for this anytime soon? Probably not. But the experiment helps us understand what causes this bone degradation in the hopes that maybe we can counteract it in these astronauts. So very cool work, directly related to what we've been talking about in class. I provided a link to the original source paper as well as the popular news article on this topic in your class program for Friday. So be sure to check that out. And remember, you can expect questions about human anatomy in the news on your upcoming quizzes and exams. So for example, your upcoming quiz this Friday won't include this topic because we're only covering material through Monday's class in your quiz on Friday, but it will, for example, include a question on the study we talked about on the gene that causes redheadedness, for example. So make sure you're looking over that material. And again, I'm not going to get super in depth with those questions. The questions will be regarding the aspects of the study that I discuss in class. So make sure you've got that. And it also is interesting to go and read the popular science article about a given topic. That usually takes about 5 minutes and will provide you a good overview of what the study is about and also how it's relevant to class. So cool stuff there. I thought a good way to get things started for today. Anyone have any questions or comments on that before we dive into our appendicular skeletons? All right, mice in space, there it is. Let's talk more about your bones then, your meaning human, with the appendicular skeleton. Now, as a reminder, our coverage of the skeleton so far focused on the postcranial axial skeleton. So remember, the axial skeleton is all the bones down the middle of the body, which includes specifically the bones of the skull, the vertebral column, or the spinal column, as well as your rib cage and the sternum. Now, we focused on the postcranial axial skeleton, so we are going to save the skull for a little bit later. And we talked about the rib cage, and we talked about your spine. Now we're moving to the appendicular skeleton, which is all the bones associated with your limbs. And we're going to start at the top and kind of work our way down. So first, let's talk about the pectoral girdle. A girdle here refers to a series of bones that connects your appendages, your arms and your legs, to your axial skeleton. And the pectoral girdle includes just 2 bones, or specific, I guess, 2 bones on each side, so 4 bones total. That is the clavicle and the scapula. And you can see in the image here, this is an anterior view of the upper of the pectoral girdle on the right side. And you can see here is the sternum down the middle. You see the ribs. The 2 bones we're focusing on is the clavicle, also commonly known as the collarbone, as well as the scapula, which you see all back here. Most of it is actually posterior to the rib cage. Now, what's important is that this girdle, this pectoral girdle, is very loosely attached to your axial skeleton. In fact, the only direct articulation of bone on bone between your arms and your axial skeleton is right here, where the clavicle articulates with the superior end of the sternum. Otherwise, all of the attachments of your arms to your body are through tendons and muscle and tissue, but not directly through a direct bone articulation or a joint. Note the top part of this sternum is referred to as the manubrium. You can kind of see the outline of the manubrium here, and that articulates with the clavicle, and that is known as the acromioclavicular joint. Acromioclavicular coming from joining the word acromio, which is oh no, excuse me, I'm getting this wrong. My bad. Let me back up for a second. This joint here. Well, let me just pause there. I'll just leave it there. We have this joint between the clavicle and the manubrium. And then we have a second joint where this clavicle or collarbone bone joins your scapula at this acromioclavicular joint. Acromioclavicular referring to the acromial process of the scapula. We'll talk about that in a second. And the clavicle there. So you've got 2 joints I want you to know. Now, what's important to note is, I actually went through this backwards. Now I have my animation up for this. This joint here is the sternoclavicular joint. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause. I'm going to rewind 2 minutes, and I'm going to re-articulate what I just said in the order that I had originally organized it so it's more clear. So I'm not going to present new information. I'm going to repeat what I just said, but repeat it in a more clear fashion. So I'm going to back up a slide here and talk about the articulation of the pectoral girdle with the axial skeleton. The pectoral girdle is composed of 2 bones, the clavicle and the scapula. The clavicle and the scapula articulate at this joint, the acromioclavicular joint, coming from the term for this process on the scapula, the acromial process, and the clavicle, the name of this bone here, also known as the collarbone. And you can see that's a rather small joint, and it provides a lot of range of motion, but not a lot of structural stability. The second joint I want you to know in the pectoral girdle is this important joint, the sternoclavicular joint. This is where the sternum that you see here, this is in the very center of the chest, articulates with the clavicle. So sternoclavicular referring to the articulation of the sternum with the clavicle. Now, what's important about this joint is this is the only place where we have a joint of bone articulating with bone between that pectoral girdle and the axial skeleton. Now, because of this, because the pectoral girdle is only loosely attached to your axial skeleton, it provides, there's two important things you need to know about that. The first is the advantage this provides. This gives you great range of motion in your arms to do a whole bunch of things. Anyone that plays a sport involving throwing or catching, which is almost all of the sports in some way, you are constantly, I guess there's swimming too, where you're not using that. Almost any sport, you're exhibiting a great range of motion with your arms. And you're able to do that because of this very loose, I'll say, articulation between this pectoral girdle and your axial skeleton. Now, the flip side of that, the downside, is that this reduces stability. So your arms aren't super tightly attached to your axial skeleton, which can lead to injury. So for example, something like a dislocated shoulder, or even injuries to the soft tissues in that joint, rotator cuff injuries, and things like that. So you have a trade-off here. You have increased flexibility and range of motion on one hand, but on the other hand, you have a looser joint that could be potentially more prone to injuries. Now, we see this functionally. What this results in is the scapula can move freely. So if you're sitting there right now, you go ahead and hunch your shoulders and move your shoulders around. It's actually best if you do it with somebody, but you can kind of reach your backhand up and touch your shoulder blade here and move that arm around, and you can feel your scapula sliding and moving around against your back. And that's because there's no direct articulation between that scapula and your axial skeleton. Next time you're with a friend, you can, you put your hand on somebody's back and have them move around their arms, and you feel this great range of motion of that scapula. The next important articulation of the pectoral girdle is this joint here between the scapula and the proximal end of your humerus. Your humerus being the bone of your upper arm. We'll talk about it in more detail later on today. This feature on your scapula is called the glenoid cavity. It's the shallow depression. The glenoid cavity is kind of like a cup that the head of the humerus fits into, but it's a very shallow cup. Again, we have this trade-off here. A shallow cup means there's a great range of motion. We can move our arm in all kinds of directions, but it also, again, makes this joint a little unstable and potentially prone to injuries. So to re-articulate, that was good. Get that one? Re-articulate. I didn't even mean to make that joke. I have no idea if anybody is laughing right now or not, but I'm going to pretend that all of you thought that was hilarious. So to re-articulate, we've got two major bones of the pectoral girdle, two bones in the pectoral girdle. I said major bones, but there's only two bones, the clavicle and the scapula. The clavicle articulates with the sternum at the, actually, let me just go back, at the sternoclavicular joint here. The clavicle, the lateral side of the clavicle, then articulates with your scapula at the acromioclavicular joint. Then we have the articulation between the humerus and the scapula. And I'll talk more detail about this shortly. What I want you to take away right now is the glenoid cavity of the scapula is this shallow cup that provides great flexibility, but not a whole lot of stability. Now, most of the muscles that move the upper limb, meaning that allow you to do this stuff with your arm, attach to either your clavicle or the scapula. And we'll talk about these muscles, the muscles of the rotator cuff, for example, also your deltoid muscles on your shoulder, your pectoral muscles in your chest. All of those muscles generally articulate with one of these two bones that allow the arm, that provide a leverage point for the arm to move against the pectoral girdle. So let's get into a little more detail here about the clavicle. The clavicle extends across the superior thorax, meaning that it's at the top of your chest cavity, basically. And you can feel your clavicle here. You're very familiar with this, commonly called the collarbone. The sternal end articulates with the manubrium. So this is the medial side that's articulating with that top part of your sternum at the sternoclavicular joint. In the acromial end, the lateral side articulates with the scapula at the acromioclavicular joint that I just mentioned. Now, what's kind of cool is that the way this bone is curved generally, so here we have the sternal end and the lateral side. And so this is a superior view. Imagine yourself looking down on somebody and looking at the right shoulder. So their sternum would be here, their arm would be over here. And you can see this bone has this really nice curvature to it. And specifically, it's curved anteriorly for about 2/3 of its length from the sternum as you move laterally. And what happens here is that what generally the result of this is that if this bone is subject to injury, which can happen especially when you fall and you land your weight on your shoulder kind of laterally like that, it will crack it in such a way that the bone generally breaks so that the curvature moves outward, right? And so that's commonly called a collarbone fracture. Some of you have probably experienced this. Now, a collarbone fracture is tough because, as I mentioned, this clavicle is the only direct articulation between your entire limb and your axial skeleton. So for it to heal properly, you basically need to immobilize that entire arm for an extended period of time so that bone can heal. Functionally, the clavicle serves some pretty important roles. As I mentioned, it's an attachment point for muscles like your pectoralis major, which is your chest muscles, your trapezius, which is a large muscle, large muscles of your back, as well as your deltoid, which are these large muscles over your shoulder. They all attach to your clavicle. Furthermore, they hold the scapula and arms laterally. So they are what keeps your arms at shoulders width. If this bone fractures, such as a collarbone fracture, your shoulder will kind of collapse into your arm. Nothing is going to hold your arm out in the position it is other than this single bone. And finally, it transmits compression forces from the upper limbs to the axial skeleton. In other words, any weight that you're bearing on your arms is transmitted via the collarbone to your axial skeleton, which is why it's prone to injury if you fall and land on your shoulder or your arms, that all of that weight basically gets put through that single bone to transmit it to your axial skeleton. Also, if you're doing something like brachiating, if you're hanging or climbing monkey bars or something like that, that puts a lot of all of that weight from your lower body, in this case, is transmitted to your upper body via this joint as well. So it's a very important articulation point between everything that happens with your arms and the rest of your body. And so that's the scapula. We will look at this in detail in the lab. There's some specific features on here, the trapezoid line and the conoid tubercle. We'll talk about that in more detail in lab, where you can actually pick up some examples of this and look at it and name those features. Right now, I'm more interested in orienting you to where these bones are and their functional role. So that's all I have to say about the clavicle for the moment. Let me pause and see what questions you have.
Could you just go over the pectoral girdle again, or just at least show the photo of it?
Sure. Let me go back here. So here we have the pectoral girdle, just one side. And again, this is the composed of just two bones on either side, I should be clear, the clavicle and the scapula. That's okay, good.
Oh,
Any other questions?
Sorry, I just had a question because it came to my head about like when you dislocate your arm. So how does that work in the sense of this like whole system?
Yeah, dislocation of the arm is usually right here. It's where the head of the humerus comes out of socket of this very shallow glenoid cavity. And so in that case, the arm, the shoulder girdle will generally be intact more or less, but the arm won't be articulating with that shoulder girdle until you get it back into place. So yeah, two common injuries we can see here with the shoulder girdle. One is the dislocated arm, which is here, and then also a collarbone fracture, which is when the bone breaks somewhere in this region here. Good question. Any others before we talk about your scapula? All right, scapula it is. So the scapula, I want to emphasize, is on the dorsal surface of your ribs. So you can see it's probably a little bit of a small diagram, but this is from your book. You have a better version of this. It's mostly on it's mostly behind these ribs and a little bit lateral. The scapula is this really funky shaped bone, and you'll be very familiar with this shape between the next 10 minutes or so and then in lab. And so generally this triangular shape, and it has three borders, a superior border, which is the top, a medial border, which goes kind of runs more or less parallel to your spinal cord in your back, and then a lateral border, which is kind of at an angle here, going from generally like the back part of your armpit down to the middle of your back. And so right here, this view on the left side is the anterior view. So imagine you're looking through someone's rib cage and seeing the scapula this way. You have some attachment points and muscles. I labeled them on here, but don't worry about them now. We'll get to that when we talk about skeletal muscles. The takeaway message here is that there's a lot of muscle attachments on the scapula for muscles both of the back and the arm. Now, here we have, I mentioned there's three borders, the superior, medial, and lateral border. And with this come the three angles, the lateral angle, which is right here, superior angle, which is over here, and the inferior angle. And again, you can feel this bone in these shapes very clearly through your back. You can kind of do it on yourself, but especially if you've got a close friend, you can give them a back massage. That's what you can do. You can win a great friend. You can offer them a back massage, but secretly be trying to identify these aspects of their scapula. And they'll think that you're just kind of being awesome, but really you're studying anatomy. That's kind of a weird suggestion. You don't really have to follow that, but you could. Okay, so let's talk about a little more aspects of the scapula here. This is a posterior view. So imagine you're looking at someone's back if they're facing away from you. And the most prominent feature of the scapula from the posterior view is going to be this large spine. And this is the part that you really can feel when you reach your hand back there, and you can feel that going across your back. That's the spine of the scapula. A couple other important features here. Again, from this view, we have the superior, medial, and lateral borders, the same as from the other view. But now we have a really nice view of three features that I want you to be familiar with on the scapula. And that is the acromion. So remember, we had the acromioclavicular joint. That's where the clavicle articulates with this, this process here called the acromion, and that joint is right about here. We also have the glenoid cavity. You can't see it very well from this perspective. I'll show you it from a lateral view in just a moment. That's that shallow cavity that articulates with the proximal end of the humerus. And then we have this coracoid process, which is this kind of funky bit of bone tissue that kind of folds out and over like this. Coracoid, the root of that comes from the word for crow. And it's because it kind of looks like a crow's head, I guess, is why they named it that. And you can feel that coracoid process if you put your fingers and you kind of dig into your shoulder a little bit right there. You can feel the acromion, and you can feel that coracoid process kind of right in there as well, which is neat. It's always nice to be able to find these features on your own body. So be sure to know for a scapula, be able to identify the superior, medial, and lateral borders, and then also make sure you can identify the acromion, the glenoid cavity, the coracoid process, and the spine. And again, I'm showing you this in lecture. In lab, you'll have a chance to look at all of this in great detail. I got a little ahead of myself on my slides. Let me talk about why these processes are important. The coracoid process, here we have ligaments attaching to that kind of bind the clavicle and the scapula together here, provide some more structural stability to the shoulder girdle. Also, both your biceps brachii, or actually not just your biceps brachii has an attachment point here as well. Your biceps brachii just simply being your bicep. And so that muscle has its attachment point on this coracoid process in your scapula. Additionally, this scapular spine here ends in this acromion. So the spine is kind of continuous with the acromion. And again, that's where it articulates with the clavicle, as I mentioned earlier. And as I mentioned earlier, the glenoid cavity is this shallow fossa. Remember, a fossa is like a flat area of a bone, and that's where the humerus articulates with the scapula. We can look at both the anterior and posterior views together here to see how this kind of looks in 3D. Again, it's a little bit of a funky bone shape. A couple other features of the scapula you should know are some additional fossa. So I mentioned the glenoid fossa, which is that shallow cup. We have 3 others that I want to walk you through. The first, if we look at the posterior view, so again, looking at someone from the back, so this would be looking, if someone was facing away from you, this would be their right shoulder blade here. You can see the lateral border, the medial border, the lateral border, and the superior border here. And we have these 2 large flat areas, one above the spine and one below the spine, appropriately called the supraspinous fossa. So supra meaning above, spinous meaning the spine. So the fossa above the spine, and then the infraspinous fossa. Infra meaning below or inferior to. So it's the fossa below the spine. If we look at the scapula from the anterior view, we have the subscapular fossa. So this is the flat surface that is essentially, it's not directly articulating with your ribs, but you can think of it as being aligned with the backs of your ribs in your back. So be sure to know these features of your scapula as well. Again, we'll look at this in more detail in lab. I just want to introduce you to some of these now. And finally, if we take a right scapula and we look at it from the lateral aspect, we can see that the bone looks entirely different and kind of has this almost like a wrench shape, right? Now, looking at it, so this is as if you're looking at someone's right scapula from the lateral aspect. So imagine that this person's face is pointing off to the right-hand side of your screen and their shoulder is invisible. You can see this very shallow glenoid cavity. Again, that's where the humerus articulates. And then you can see the acromion here. You can see the spine coming out here. You can see the coracoid process here. I've got some other things labeled on here, the glenoid tubercles, infraglenoid tubercles, etc. Don't worry about those just yet. We'll get to those in more detail in lab. What I want to make sure you can identify, again, is this coracoid process right here, the acromion here, the glenoid cavity here, or the glenoid fossa, and then also the fossa, the infraspinous fossa, which is this flat area down here. You can't really see it in this view. The supraspinous fossa, which is up here. Again, you can't really see it in this view. And then the subscapular fossa, which is along this side. Again, you can't really see it in this view, but you can see on this kind of simplified diagram where those different flat areas are. So a number of features to make sure you are familiar with on the scapula. That's all I'm going to say about scapula for the moment. Let me pause here and see what questions you have. And then I have a short drawing activity to break things up a little bit. Any questions? We're good. All right. So what I'd like you to do is take 2 minutes, and I want you to draw a left scapula from the posterior aspect. And so I've shown you some diagrams of the right scapula from the posterior. I want you now to kind of flip that around. And I'd like you to label the coracoid process, the acromion, the glenoid cavity, the spine, the supraspinous fossa, and the infraspinous fossa. Go. The timer is not working. I don't know why it stopped, but let's give it another minute or so. All right, now's just a chance to catch your breath a little bit and make sure you're familiar with these features. As you know, I'm a big fan of drawing to help you remember where these different parts are. So you should have drawn a diagram that looks something like this. I kind of gave you some help by providing that image. And you should have labeled a number of features like this. So notice the supraspinous fossa is above the spine, which is right here. The infraspinous fossa is below it. You have the glenoid cavity. It's a little tough actually to see from this angle, but you can still point to it here. The coracoid process here, and the acromion here. So hang on to that image. You'll upload that an image of that drawing at the end of class today as part of your ticket out. All right, let me see if you have any questions before we dive into our next exciting topic, which is the upper limb. Actually, I'll go back, make sure you've got that. Any questions? All right, upper limb. Let's do the upper limb. There are 30 bones total in each of your upper limbs. So you have 60 of your bones are found in your arms, and they are grouped into, we put them into 3 groups. The arm, which is from your shoulder to your elbow, also known as the brachium. The forearm, which is from your elbow to your wrist, we call this the antebrachium. And then your hand, which is everything from your wrist to your fingertips. Now, it's pretty easy to identify the bones of the arm and forearm. There's 1 bone of the arm or brachium, the humerus. There's 2 bones of the forearm, your ulna and your radius. And then the remaining 27 bones are all in the wrist and your phalanges or your fingers. So let's walk through these. The humerus is, as I said, is the only bone of the brachium, the arm here, and is the longest and strongest bone of the upper limb. It articulates with the scapula proximally at the glenoid cavity, as we talked about, that shallow cavity. And distally, it articulates with both the radius and the ulna at your elbow. And I want to look at some features of this bone in a little more detail, and we'll get into this articulation at the elbow in a little more detail as well. So, important stuff to know in your humerus. First, you've heard me mention several times the head of the humerus, again, where it articulates with the scapula. Just lateral to the head of the humerus, we have what's called the great tubercle. This is a kind of rough spot on the bone where the muscles of the rotator cuff, your shoulder muscles, have their insertions, their attachment points. We then have the neck of the bone, and there's 2 things to note here. There's the surgical neck and the anatomical neck. The anatomical neck is here basically dividing the diaphysis, the long part of the bone, from the epiphysis, the end of the bone. So anatomically, it's important here. This is where the growth plate is. We call this part down here the surgical neck because this is the spot that often breaks, and so it has more medical implications. So anatomically, we would call the neck of the bone here, between the epiphysis and the diaphysis, and the surgical neck is here where it's more prone to breaking. I'm not going to get into too much of those specific details, but I want to make sure you're aware of those terms. We then have a couple different features on the bone. We have a groove, the radial groove, along which travels your radial nerve, and we have this deltoid tuberosity. Tuberosity is a kind of rough spot on a bone that we have muscles attaching. And in this case, our deltoid muscle attaches here. The deltoid being this big muscle on your shoulder that has its attachment point on this tuberosity on your humerus. We then have a couple other important features here. I would like you to make sure you know the lateral and medial epicondyles. Epicondyles are like bulbous features on bones. And so we have these two ends of the bone, the lateral epicondyle, of course, being on the outside, and the medial epicondyle, of course, being on the inside. Now remember, in anatomical position, your inside of your elbow is facing out. And so your medial epicondyle is going to be here and the lateral epicondyle there. We also have a fossa, which is this big kind of flat area at the bottom. This is called the olecranon fossa. And I'll talk about that when I talk about the ulna a little bit more, but there's like basically the lever arm of the ulna kind of fits into that fossa. And then you have this really important kind of almost cylindrical, smooth part of the bone down here called the trochlea. This is where your humerus articulates with the ulna at that elbow joint. And the structure of the trochlea and the olecranon fossa, as well as part of your ulna, provide a joint that is very, very good at moving, but only in one direction. You think about, you can move your elbow like this really well. However, it's limited. You cannot move your elbow side to side. Other joints, for example, your shoulder, you can move in all these different directions. Your elbow is very limited in its range of motion and can only move this way. Furthermore, it can only move to about 180 degrees, maybe a little further in this direction, but it's very difficult to hyperextend your elbow. And that is because of the structure of the way these two bones, your humerus and your ulna, kind of interact and essentially lock into each other at the elbow. In addition to these features, if we look at an anterior view, so if we look at the front of the arm here, we find features we've already seen: the head of the humerus, the greater tubercle, the anatomical neck here. We also see the smaller rough spot here called the lesser tubercle, which is the attachment point for other rotator cuff muscles. We have this kind of deep groove here called the intertubercular sulcus. So between intertubercular, meaning between the tubercles, the lesser tubercle here and the greater one here. And you have these tendons that run along this sulcus here. Sulcus simply, it's basically it means a groove or like a furrow. Let's see here. We've got the two flat areas on the front of your humerus here, the coronoid fossa and the radial fossa. And then we have the capitulum, which is on the lateral side here, and it's this kind of rounded, very rounded area just adjacent to the trochlea, which I mentioned earlier. So a lot of features here. Again, I'm introducing these now. You're going to have a chance in lab to really work through and explore these. You'll look at bones. You'll be looking at axial skeletons. You'll be seeing how they articulate. So please keep in mind, as we're walking through this material today, you'll have plenty of chance to interact with it in more detail as we move through the next couple weeks of class. But I want to talk about this now. I think I might actually not talk about the antebrachium now. I think what I'll do is pause here and see what questions you have, and then we can wrap things up. And you do have a ticket out today, and we can end a few minutes early. What questions do you have for me?
Would you be able to post like photos of these so that we can use them to review where all the different places are?
Yeah, so all of these images are in your textbook.
Oh, perfect.
I took all of this from your book, and what's not from your book, you will get in your lab guide. If not, I don't remember if it's next week's lab or the following lab, but you'll have access to all of this.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, absolutely. All right, I'm just going to skip through the forearm real quick. There you go. Boom, boom. Okay, now we all know that. We're going to go through the lower limb real quick here. Okay, perfect. Everyone's got that. Great. So just a couple reminders as we wrap up. We have a quiz on Friday. Remember, the quiz will be the same format as your first quiz. It will open up after class and be due the following Monday. It is covering material, remember, from where we left off with the last quiz through what we covered in the postcranial axial skeleton. So specifically, you need to know the integumentary system, bones, and the skeletal system. So that includes cartilage. and then the skeleton through through not including the appendicular skeleton, so not including what we covered today. You'll have short answer and multiple choice questions, just like last time. Open book, open note. You got to do it yourself, and it's designed to take 20 minutes. Based on your surveys, it looks like for most of you, it took closer to 30 minutes, but I will have it open in Blackboard for 3 hours. You've got lots of time to complete it, and it is worth a total of 30 course points, due Monday, as I said. One reminder, I know I've said this before, but as you're completing it, it is open book, but please stick to materials from the class to answer questions. It will help you understand the material better, and also at the end of the day, get a better grade. All right, with that, I just have a ticket out for today. I have a question for you as well. Oh, you know what? The question for today, you might not be able to answer the extra survey question on there because we didn't get quite that far. Go ahead and try to answer it based on what you know. I'm not going to grade it based on if you got it right or wrong. Go ahead and try to answer that other question. Upload your drawing from today. I'm going to pause the recording here, but I will stay online until you log off in case anyone has any questions. Once you've got your ticket out, you're good to go. And I will look forward to seeing everyone in class on Friday. Stay safe and warm in the upcoming ice storm too. It's going to be exciting weather the next couple days for everyone. All right. Thanks everyone. Have a good afternoon.